Too much respect for everyone in that room. All right. There's always challenges. I can honestly say I've never had a challenge like we have now. That's understood. All right, let's get the show started. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Baton Rouge, our noon hybrid meeting. We have in this year of years, we have a new first for us. Our speaker, who is going to be coming to us from France, 7 hours ahead of us right now. So we'll have a very interesting day, and thanks again to the tech committee for getting this set. We'll start off with the invocation by Ken Best.
Our Heavenly Father, on this Veterans Day, we offer our thanks for the many blessings bestowed upon us. We understand that it is the veteran, not the preacher, who has given us freedom of religion. It's the veteran, not the reporter, who has given us freedom of the press. It's the veteran, not the poet, who has given us freedom of speech. It's the veteran, not the corporate campus organizer, who has given us freedom to assemble. It's the veteran, not the lawyer, who has given us the right to a fair trial. It is the veteran, not the politician, who has given us the right to vote. It is the veteran who has guaranteed our freedom. We thank you for all the men and women who have served and are serving in our nation's armed forces. Protect them and bring them home safely to us. Bless this food to our nourishment, and bless this Rotary Club as we pursue our motto of service above self. Amen. President Haggai has asked that I lead the invocation and the four-way test. Please face the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now the four-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you, Ken. So today is Veterans Day. As I call your name, would you please stand? Jim Fernberg served in the Army. Mick Malden, Army. Berlin Perkins, Army. John Pugh, Army. Ronnie Toomer, Army. John Bateman, Marines. Ken Best, Marines. Fritz Imbaugh, Marines. Tina Holland, Marines. Ian Malonzo, Marines. Gene Baggett, Navy. Jay Brown, Air Force. Fred Sibley, Air Force. Jay Zimmerman, Navy and Coast Guard. Thank you for your service. One of the favorite things that any president gets to do is have new members introduced. So we will start today with two new members introduced. Our first will be introduced by Charlene Montalero and Kent Gonsolin, introducing Ann Hendricks.
To all those who stood up, the veterans, thank you for your service from the bottom of my heart. We have a special new member, so special, in fact, it's going to take two of us to introduce her. So I'd like to turn it over to my co-proposer, Charlene.
Thank you, Kent. Delayed since March, we are thrilled to finally introduce Ann Webb Hendricks to you as our newest Rotarian. I first met Ann and her extended family when I moved to Baton Rouge and joined St. Thomas More Church. I found Ann to be a person of deep faith, kindness, and conviction. As I have gotten to know Ann through the community, I have witnessed firsthand her deep compassion, care, commitment, and dedication to the children of McMain's Children's Developmental Center. Ann began working at McMain's 32 years ago as a social worker, providing case management and counseling for children and families. A consummate professional, Ann continued her work at the center, first as clinical and operations director in 2013, until assuming the role of executive director in 2017. Ann leads a very close-knit staff at McMain's who work collaboratively to assist families and children reach the goal of independence through speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and so much more, including an adaptive playground, adaptive garden, and an inclusion house for those children with the most severe neuromotor disorders to learn how to participate in household activities with assisted technologies. Ann is a licensed social worker and is a board-approved clinical supervisor. She is a member of the United Cerebral Palsy and Court Case for Inclusion Committee, Autism Stakeholders Task Force 1, and is a member of the Intercivic Council, just to name a few others. Ann has been married to her husband, Al, for 29 years. They have one son and daughter-in-law, Josh and Katie. They also have a daughter and future son-in-law, Ashlyn and Jonathan. In her free time, Ann loves spending time with family and friends, reading good books, and enjoys a really good cup of coffee. And she probably does those two a lot, a ton. And now I'm going to turn this back over to my co-sponsor, Kent Gonsolin, for the last words.
On a personal note, I've been knowing Ann for over 20 years. She and my wife, Courtney, used to work together at McMain's before Ann rose through the ranks to become the executive director. So we've watched each other's children grow up, and we've known that family for a long time, over 20 years. One time, Ann and my wife, Courtney, were just kind of sitting around and they were talking about their husbands. And Ann was saying, how wonderful Al was, her husband. And Courtney said, well, I have to admit it's not easy being married to a Cajun from Loreauville. As a matter of fact, some of the things they do, she said, for example, every Thanksgiving, he wants gumbo instead of turkey. He thinks that the 4 seasons are onion, bell pepper, celery, and garlic. Anyone in his family can go to Crowley, look at a rice field, and tell you how much gravy it's going to take to eat it up. So as a matter of fact, my father gave Kent a parrot for our wedding gift. Yeah, a talking parrot. And Kent had the parrot for about a week, and my dad called Kent up and said, hey, Kent, how's the parrot? And Kent said, oh, it was delicious. My dad said, well, you ate the parrot? He said, that parrot could speak in 5 languages. And Kent said, well, if he could talk 5 languages, how come he didn't say something? Welcome, Ann.
Thank you.
And now Deborah Todd will introduce Eric Thomas.
Good afternoon. It's my great honor to introduce to you my friend, Eric Thomas. Since 2007, Eric has served as a vice president and general manager for Nexstar Broadcasting, located in Abilene and Lubbock, Texas, and since 2017 in Baton Rouge. His current responsibilities are managing Fox 44, NBC 33, CW 21, KZUP, PR Proud, the news app, and the Nexstar Digital Services of Baton Rouge. Eric is an accomplished industry executive with over 27 years of combined local broadcasting and sales management experience. During his tenure at Nexstar and in the industry, Eric has developed and led highly effective sales teams and implemented sales, marketing, and digital initiatives that resulted in increased market share and profitability in every market. He also provided strategic news and sales oversight, resulting in increased sales, revenue, and strong broadcast cash flows. In addition, Eric is a 2-time recipient of the Texas Association of Broadcasters Public Service Award for outstanding service to his community. While Eric is relatively new to Baton Rouge and the business community, he's not actually new to Baton Rouge. Both of his parents grew up here and attended LSU. Up to his high school years, he lived in Slidell until Shell Oil moved his dad to the Houston area. He still managed to regularly visit, though, for summer fishing trips and hunting in the Atchafalaya. Eric earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Texas Tech University, where he met his beautiful wife, Kim, of 27 years. Together, they have 2 adult children, Jordan, 25, and Ethan, 22. Eric currently serves on the executive board of the Baton Rouge Area Chamber. He supports Opera Louisiana, the Baton Rouge Symphony, the Better Business Bureau, the Salvation Army, the Greater Baton Rouge Food Bank, St. Vincent de Paul, Heritage Ranch, Brew, and a host of additional nonprofits. If asked, Eric will say Baton Rouge is the best place he has ever lived. Both Kim and he feel they have found their people. Before COVID, every weekend was filled with festivals, carnivals, and parades, and they look forward to when they can get back to that schedule. Although I've seen their Facebook pages and they're going to New Orleans quite a bit. He eagerly looks forward to 2021, where hopefully he will be riding in the Endymion Parade. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, Eric Thomas.
Welcome, both of you, to the Rotary Club. Your head table, from my right, your left, we have Tina Holland, past president at Franciscan Ministries of Our Lady University. Thomas Brown, the owner, managing director, Advanced Sealing International. I'm Haggai Davis, your club president, and Ken Best, who is our past president. He is with J.K. Best, Inc. Oh, and Thomas Brown is also past president. Your head table. Couple of quick announcements. The Volunteers in Baton Rouge is looking for some assistance. The Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative is requesting a partnership for this critical initiative. Also, next Wednesday, our speaker will be Genevieve Silverman, the president and CEO of Nexus LA, and she was speaking to us about how innovation shapes a city's growth. Everyone is welcome to join us. And if you can't be here, obviously we will still be on YouTube and Facebook. The meeting does start at 12:15. And now Thomas Brown will introduce our speaker.
It is indeed my privilege to introduce the speaker today. He's coming to us from across the pond in Paris, France. I do believe that is a first for the Rotary Club of Baton Rouge. Quite an extraordinary feat. Well done, tech guys. Well done. This distinguished scholar is a professor emeritus at Yale University in the Department of History. He's a prolific author. He's an editor, a producer, a screenwriter, and the chief historian for PBS and the BBC. He's taught at universities all over the world, and he is a specialist on World War I. Today, he's going to speak to us on the post-World War I era, after the Armistice, and about how the war to end all wars never really ended. So please join me and welcome Professor Jay Winter.
Well, thank you indeed for inviting me to share this day with you. It's a day that has substantial meaning here in France, where I now live, and it has meaning all over the world as the end of the worst war to date in history. The problem is it's much easier to start a war than to stop it. And one of the things that my colleagues and I have spent a lot of time in doing over the last few years is to point out that what we celebrate, rightly so, on the 11th of November is the return home of millions of men who fought in the War of 1914-18. The problem is that their return home after the armistice of the 11th of November 1918 was only part of the story. Indeed, it's only part of the American story. There were American soldiers who remained to continue fighting after 1918 in such a way as to make the period after the First World War, 1918 to 23, probably bloodier and more formative for the 20th century than the wars 1914 to 18. I want to explain why. So my fundamental idea that I want to give to you is simply that war didn't end in 1918, and Armistice Day was a hope rather than an achievement. And the reasons why are threefold. The first is, before Armistice Day and before the defeat of Germany, the primary culprit in the First World War, the Russian Revolution of 1917 started a whole range of conflicts that carried on, one could argue, until 1991, but certainly didn't stop in 1918. They were just getting going. The second reason is that once Armistice Day happened, four great empires fell apart. The Russian Empire fell apart because of the Russian Revolution, but there were three other empires that fell apart: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And the states that succeeded, that followed the collapse of these empires, were hardly states to speak of. They didn't have legal systems, they didn't have armies, and above all, they didn't have working economies. And what we need, we all know that, in order for there to be stable democracies, there have to be stable economies. And from 1917, before the First World War ended, until 1923, the world economy went through one of its worst downturns in such a way as to imperil the peace that everyone rightly celebrates today. So what I want to suggest is that the 11th of November is more a dream than a reality. It was hoping that war would end rather than achieving the end of war. And what made it so dangerous and so difficult for the rest of the 20th century is that failure for the war to end changed the character of war itself. By that I mean between 1914 and 18, mostly, there are exceptions, war was fought between armies, military agents of states or empires. From 1918 on, we could start in 1917 if you wish, but from 1918 on, wars were fought primarily between military groups of many different kinds and civilians. This is what I call the civilianization of war. The civilianization of war is a mutant form of war which has dominated the 20th century. In the First World War, perhaps 11 million men died in combat, which is a staggering figure. The number doubled in the Second World War, but that didn't tell more than half of the story. Perhaps 50 million people died in the Second World War, most of them civilians. And of course, that also meant most of those who died in the Second World War were women. So the First World War is the last 19th century war where armies fought with each other until there was, as it were, an agreement on one of the parties or another to go to the peace conference and to declare the war over. That happened. The peace was signed on the 28th of June, 1919, but the war didn't end. And largely the reason for that is the Russian Revolution, which in 1917 created a whole set of conflicts that lasted throughout the 20th century. So if the First World War, if you will, World War I lasted from 1914 to 1918, the war that followed it can have many different names. You can call it the Second Great War if you want, or the post-war war, created the world that lasted throughout the 20th century. And it was a much more violent world than the powers knew that engaged in 1914 to 18. Let me try to show you all of the chaos that followed war in order to make my point that what happened after Armistice Day was anything but peace. If I could see the first slide, please. It's a slide that'll show you something that looks like the Alps on the right and maybe a little bit of the foothills, or if you will, the Rockies on the right and some of the foothills on the left. Already in 1917, most of the countries that fought in the war were hungry. most of them. The United States was lucky in not having gotten into the war until 1917, but those who got in 1914 were not only unable to secure victory until 1918, but started running out of food. And when they started running out of food, populations, not only in the home front, but also in the front, wanted to know why they were fighting at all. And the answer to that question, by and large, became very, very blurry the longer the war went on. If the rich still had some food, the poor certainly didn't. The next slide, please. And we can see one of the precipitants of the Russian Revolution was the price of bread. This is a women's strike over the rising price of bread in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. For a time it was Leningrad. But Petrograd in 1917 was the, as it were, the cradle of the Russian Revolution. And it's at that point that the question of social conflict, ethnic conflict, class conflict took over the significance of military conflict that had dominated the previous 3 years. Next slide, please. What we're going to see is that it worked on both sides. It wasn't just the Russians who were allies of Britain, France, and the United States, but on the German side, I'll just show you this for a moment. If you think that the economic problems of the United States are difficult, you should take a look what happened to Russia. In 1917 and 1918, they printed 5 times the currency that they had in their gold reserves. The result of that was the worst inflationary spiral in history. And the worst inflationary spiral of history wiped out the savings of the middle class. It made elderly people, I'm now retired and particularly sensitive to the position of the retired, and made their position almost impossible because we elderly people live on fixed incomes, retirement packages that we've earned and put away. They were wiped out by the inflation that destroyed the German war effort. And what it produced was revolution in Germany. Next slide, please. Now, revolution in Germany was only one of the terrible moments that we have to look at. We also have to look at what war did to intensify the social conflicts that existed within all competent countries, and that includes the United States. We know that race riots followed the entry of the United States into the war, so that if social conflict can be understood as a product of the Russian Revolution, it's not the only way in which social conflict was intensified and deepened by the First World War and carried on to a very remarkable extent thereafter. The next slide, please. The next slide will show another form of what I call the brutalization of war. A trade unionist in Illinois, and was an anti-war activist, unfortunately did not take American citizenship. By that I mean he could have. There were a lot of Germans who took American citizenship and fought and died with American forces. But this particular gentleman, Robert Prager, who was born in Germany, was not only a trade unionist, but an anti-war figure in Illinois. And some prominent figures found that the presence of a German national among them was intolerable. He was lynched. And when he was, the people who lynched him were put on trial, we can see them in front of us now, they were acquitted because what they did was a patriotic manslaughter. Now, the point about brutalization is that it spreads throughout the world after the 11th of November without any control. The next slide, please. Here's an example of what went wrong in the First World War. What went wrong in the First World War is that the fighting carried on, even though the social conflicts within each competent country became more and more intense. This is a map showing how far the German army got to almost winning the First World War. Fortunately, the Marines at Belleau Wood in the southern sector and American forces in the east were able to push them back at a substantial cost. Roughly 50,000 American soldiers died, almost the same number who died in the war in Vietnam, and they did so in a period of roughly 6 months. The fighting of American troops in the First World War was very, very difficult, and the reason was the German army was the finest force in the world. So that defeat created the impossible situation for the German Empire. A country can't sustain its legitimacy as a regime if it doesn't bring victory and it doesn't provide food. And Germany in 1918 didn't provide either of them. Next slide, please. Here is a bread line. in Berlin in the middle of 1918. And by the time the German army realized that they couldn't win the war, their populations at home didn't have enough to eat. Those two things, military failure and the lack of food supply, inevitably led to the armistice of 11th of November 1918. Problem was, though, that the German army wasn't defeated fully. It was still in the field when it accepted the armistice. It occupied half of Belgium and a few provinces of France. So they marched back and enabled the German high command to create one of the biggest lies in history, which is that the German army wasn't defeated. It was defeated in the field. And the lie was that the German army was stabbed in the back by revolutionaries and subversives like Jews at home. That stab in the back legend was a complete lie. The German army was defeated, and largely because of American strength, in 1918. Next slide, please. Well, what happens? The German Empire collapses. The emperor is forced to abdicate. He actually is driven to the Dutch border, where he's supposed to live in exile for the rest of his life. This shocked the living daylights out of a Dutch policeman who suddenly found that the Kaiser Wilhelm II handed him over his sword and asked for some degree of safe transit to his new home. What happened in Germany was not peace, but war, social war. On the left, you'll see the red forces. On the right, you'll see the right forces. And the fighting in Berlin, in particular, in 1918 and early 1919, began to indicate exactly what I'm talking about. These people are wearing helmets and sometimes uniforms, but they're killing civilians. Right at the end of the First World War, war became civilianized. And the reason was there were no real authorities. No states were fully established, and no states had the legitimacy to organize and have a monopoly on physical force. So civil war broke out throughout all of Eastern Europe and Central Europe as well. The next slide, please. Then came the social conflict, national conflict, and religious conflict. During the First World War, there was very little in the way of anti-Semitic violence in Germany, in France, in Britain. Every country had anti-Semitic traditions, but the Jewish populations joined up just as much as the non-Jewish populations in fighting for their country. As soon as the war ended, anti-Semitic violence became endemic. And later, in Germany in particular, it became epidemic and lethal. And the reason, by and large, why this was the case is that the right-wing parties in Germany and elsewhere created a new monster. And it was a completely imaginary one. But monsters don't have to be real to be frightening. We all know that from our grandchildren and perhaps from our own childhoods. This monster was called Judeo-Bolshevism. The idea was that the Bolsheviks, who were communists, were working in cahoots with the elders of Zion. Now, this idea that there was a Jewish conspiracy to put the Bolsheviks in power is something that makes no sense whatsoever. Yes, there were a substantial number of Jews who were in the Bolshevik party, but Stalin took care of that later. It wasn't anything that worried him. He was prepared to murder Jews as much as he was prepared to murder non-Jews. He was an equal opportunity murderer of the highest order in the 20th century. But right after the outbreak of peace in 1918, this is the 22nd of November, 1918, we can see a picture here, and then we can see the next slide for what happened the next morning. That's all that's left of a Hasidic family in Galicia, in the east of Poland, which is now the city of Lvov in Ukraine. So in the areas in Central Europe, which were as it were, the center of Jewish population, a substantial number, maybe 6 to 10 million Jewish people, were living in failed states, in failed empires and failed states. And it's this moment in 1918 that gave the Nazis their very first scent of how to achieve power. It is to claim that there is a Bolshevik Jewish conspiracy that had destroyed the German war effort and that would require very substantial revenge in order to reverse their hold over not only Germany, but of Russia and the rest of Eastern Europe. This is complete nonsense. There is no truth in it. But the lie worked. The lie succeeded. Now, it wasn't the only lie going around. There were many other lies. And let's take a look at several more. I'll show you the next slide. If you can imagine that it's only the Poles or the Russians or the Ukrainians, the people who wound up in the Cold War on the eastern side. No, it also happened in Finland. Finland is an innocuous country, a very civilized country, but their historians don't talk about 1918. And the reason is a civil war broke out there, which was probably inspired by Lenin, but it didn't matter. The problem was that very quickly the anti-Bolshevik forces, led by the gentleman, General Mannerheim on the left, won. That didn't matter all that much because the 6,000 soldiers whom they captured at the end of the war and declared a peace treaty were executed in the aftermath of that war. You can see the executions were not hidden. They were done in the public. The notion, therefore, is that those who are fellow travelers of revolution, a very, very small Jewish population in Finland, were the carriers of Judeo-Bolshevism. Complete nonsense. And yet it resulted in the civilianization of the execution of prisoners after the war. These aren't soldiers. These are civilians who are being shot. Next slide, please. The Latvians did the same. They were fighting a Jewish conspiracy that didn't exist. The Nazi Party began in the midst of this post-1918 civil war. And it's that moment which created the bridge between the two world wars. It's not 1914-18, which created the Second World War. It's the period after 1918 in its violence, its civilianization, its economic instability, and its creation of entirely false and toxic ideologies that mix together nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Bolshevism. That is what did it. The next slide, please. Well, the outcome of this was a Russian civil war, which produced a stalemate. By and large, the Bolsheviks were not welcomed by the majority of the population of Russia. They wanted their land. And indeed, that's one reason why Russia left the war, because the peasant army voted with its feet, went home to seize land. Well, between 1918 and 1921, what do these communists do? The people who believe in nationalization of property, they are all in favor of the peasants seizing their own land. They changed their ideology in order to stay in power. So instead of the Bolsheviks being the people who are against private property, they fight for the right of peasants to own their own land. And who's fighting against them? Let's take a look at the next slide. The United States, France, Britain, a Czech legion, even a Greek army invades the Soviet Union in order to overthrow the Bolsheviks, so that the Western powers who saw the Bolshevik Revolution as a danger ensured its survival by intervening. This is, by the way, not the first time, obviously, that Western armies have invaded, nor will it be the last time. When the German army invaded in 1941, Stalin pointed out that it was 20 years earlier that the Western powers invaded. Now, it was a half-hearted invasion, and there are some people who compare this to Vietnam. I think that's not right. Vietnam was a much greater investment. But the United States sent forces, between 12 and 18,000 forces, throughout the eastern, or rather the western part of Russia, but what we would have called the Eastern Front. And their success was zero. None of these Renault tanks, French tanks and French soldiers in Odessa, or American troops or other troops actually succeeded in doing anything other than helping the Bolsheviks establish their popularity in the population as a whole. The next slide, please. Here's a surprise for you. The other great ally of the United States in the First World War was Japan. And at the end of the First World War, after the Bolshevik Revolution and after the Armistice, who is supposed to knock the Bolsheviks out in Siberia? The Japanese army. The biggest fighting that took place to overthrow the Bolshevik Revolution was in Siberia. We can see this as a print that was produced after the end of the invasion of the Soviet Union, when everybody suddenly realized that it wasn't working and they better find a way to make peace with them. The Japanese had the greatest military force in Asia. It's one of those moments where we can begin to see that the war to come is going to be the Japanese versus whomever it is who can try to stop them. Unfortunately, Japanese power was given a full green light to take whatever it wanted in Siberia in 1919. Next slide, please. Well, the result of the fighting was, as you can imagine, brutality, atrocities, murderousness on both sides. And indeed, if you want to get a sense of the complete chaos of the period 1918 to 1922, all you have to do is to read the novel or see the film Dr. Zhivago. Pasternak showed us what civil war is, and I'm not so sure that anyone could ever distinguish between the victims of the armies, the Red Armies on the right and the White Armies on the left. What it produced, though, was a death toll at least as high as that of the war of 1914, 1918. Next slide, please. And atrocities produced famine. Famine in Russia, though, was a moment in 1921 which I want to stop and pause for just a moment or two, because it produced something which gives us, I think, a degree of hope in this dark story. The inhumanity of war produced the humanity of the first foreign aid package in world history. And that was produced by Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is a man who should have, I think, stopped before he was elected president in 1928. His reputation did not survive the world economic crisis. But before that, his reputation was of a remarkable man. Next slide, please. He created the first foreign aid program in history, and not only created a substantial food stock for the children of France and Belgium who were occupying French and Belgian, the Germans were occupying French and Belgian soil and refusing to feed civilians because the Allies had a blockade. So Herbert Hoover, before the United States got into the war, organized a private relief effort that fed between 800,000 and 1,500,000 children for 3 years and made a profit by doing it. You can see these sacks from all kinds of groups. The Rotary clubs were very important in the provision of grain for the children of France and Belgium, occupied France and Belgium, in 1914 and 1915. And then what happens at the end of the war? The next slide, please. Is he did it again in 1918 to 1921. This time officially, Herbert Hoover created the first successful foreign aid package in history, and it made money. It was done efficiently. I think through the Walmart principle, that transport is what ultimately matters. You can develop supply, but if you have not adequate transport and communications to make sure that that transport works, you'll never get it across. And take a look at, I think, the best example I have of transport working in the next slide, which is a camel brigade, a camel column that's going through the Volga region in the middle of Russia to feed the children of Russia in 1921, when the Bolshevik regime is tottering. Now, the important point about this is that it established, I think, a fundamental issue that the inhumane, which is the story of these years, was not the only story. But it, unfortunately, the inhumane was the dominant one. And that's the point, unfortunately, I have to end on. Next slide, please. The next slide shows something that's going on today. We should all know, I'm sure, that there's a war going on in Syria. As I speak, there are people who are under threat or perhaps being killed in that war. Well, that war is an inheritor of what happened in the years after the Armistice. And what happened was a terrible idea on the part of the victorious Allies. The Ottoman Empire was defeated. But the terrible idea was the invasion by Britain, France, Italy, and Greece of Anatolia, that is to say, of the land areas of Asiatic Turkey, and the overthrow, first of the Sultan and then of a Republican regime under a new man, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And the invasion of Turkey was a catastrophe because all of the Allied forces, very much like those in Russia, succeeded in only enraging the nationalists whose land they were taking. And that produced one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Next slide, please. Which was the destruction of the city called Smyrna. Smyrna is now called Izmir. It's on the west coast of Turkey, but it was a city burned to the ground by a Turkish army whose purpose it was to assert the sovereignty of Turkey right in the areas near the refugee camps today. Now, in the areas we can still see there are refugees coming from Syria in the same ways that were refugees coming from the fighting in Turkey. Today, we can talk about 100 years later, the civilianization of war is still going on. So my conclusion is very simple. The business of remembering war on this day, on the 11th of November, is very important. And we must honor those who have the courage to fight for their countries. The question of commemoration is more difficult. The honoring of those who fight is, I think, something that all human beings who have a soul believe in. The question of remembering war is, how do we honor those who fight in war without honoring war itself? And the problem is that war is a mutant virus. I would say it's a bigger killer than COVID. There may be, so I read today, it's possible that one of the great drug companies now has a vaccine that we can all get a shot. Wouldn't it be nice if someone could develop a vaccine against war or against the people who make war possible or necessary? That's unlikely to happen in the future. What we need to do, though, is to realize that it is much, much easier for people to start a war than to stop it. And the 11th of November, as much as it matters to honor those who take their lives in their hands to defend their country, their faith, and their families, how much they are independent of the people who take the decisions that make war inevitable. Nobody intended that the First World War would go on after 1918. It wasn't anybody's decision. It was what I would call the momentum of war. Wars don't end the way in which we can stop the flow of water by turning off a spigot. The 11th of November was the end for a substantial number of people who fought, but not for all. And the legacies of the war after the war is, unfortunately, those legacies are still visible to us today. We must thank those who fought that war, but the greatest gratitude will be those who make it possible for us to avoid wars in the future. Thank you very much.
Jay, that was really a wonderful presentation. We do have one question up there on the screen. Can you speak to the war and the Spanish flu?
Yes, there is a colleague of mine has, I think, sufficient evidence to say that we now know that the Spanish flu started in Leavenworth, Kansas. And the reason we know that is that there has been very substantial microbiological work on the structure of the flu. There were soldiers who died of it, American sailors who died of it in Norway, and their bodies were buried in the tundra. They were dug up not too many years ago, and the biological research now indicates that the first point of infection and of mutation of a virus was in a major military camp. And that is the link with the First World War. The mobilization of 70 million men in the course of the First World War was the biggest vector of non-social separation that you could possibly imagine. So the First World War didn't cause the Spanish flu, but it produced the worldwide epidemic. And as a result of the spread of soldiers and the impossibility, indeed, of controlling the virus, the global war produced the first global epidemic. The question of why it stopped is something I can't answer because no one knows. And let's hope that COVID does it too. Apparently, the Spanish flu mutated back to being a virus that hit animals, possibly birds and possibly swine populations. But the answer about the link of the First World War, the Great War, and the Spanish flu is it's the mobilization of 70 million men that created the worldwide epidemic. Its initial appearance is probably what can only be described as a cursed mutation over which no one had any control.
We have one more question from Maui Tachi.
Professor Pointer, thank you for speaking to our club. Could you quickly speak about how the end of the war, the division of the colonies in Africa played a role in the ongoing stalemate?
Yes, I'd be happy to say that. Had I an additional 30 minutes, I would be happy to tell you something else that went wrong in 1918, 1919. What went wrong in 1918-19 was the beginning of the anti-colonial movement. The huge thrust towards decolonization began in 1919. And the reason it did is because Woodrow Wilson's promise of self-determination was for white men only. So those non-white members of the peace conference realized, including the Japanese, by the way, who were insulted by it, realized that they weren't supposed to have the same rights as those in Central Europe, like the Polish population. That's what Woodrow Wilson meant. The Hungarians, the Austrians, the Czechs, the Poles, they had to have self-determination. So when people who fought for victory in 1914-18 suddenly saw that if their skin was not white, this was the beginning. This was the beginning. So the best way to talk about 1918-19 is it's the high point of imperial power and the beginning of the end of imperial power.
Professor Winter, thank you very much for your presentation today.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
And everyone remember to mask up and stay safe. Meeting adjourned.
Well, that was extraordinary.
That was awesome.
I'm glad to have been a part of that.
That was worth the price of admission.
Very interesting. Yes,